Before the whispers of the great pestilence, before the cartloads of the dead and the bone-chilling terror in the night, the world of the mid-14th century believed it was already living through the apocalypse. A series of catastrophic events, a perfect storm of misery, had brought European civilization to its knees. Famine, war, and societal decay were the grim realities of the age. The people of this era were hardened, accustomed to a life of brutal hardship and early death. They didn't know it, but this was just the overture. The real cataclysm, a biological horror beyond their darkest, most fevered nightmares, had already left its ancient homeland and was silently, inexorably making its way towards them. The greatest catastrophe in human history was about to begin. To truly understand the biblical scale of the devastation the Black Death would unleash, we have to look at the world it was about to enter. It was not a world of peace and plenty. It was a world that was already sick, hungry, and exhausted. The first of the great calamities had begun decades earlier, with the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. For reasons that are still debated by climate historians, the weather patterns over northern Europe shifted dramatically. The period known as the medieval warm period came to an abrupt end, ushering in the first phase of the Little Ice Age. The result was years of relentless, chilling rain and unseasonably cold temperatures. Crops failed on a continental scale, grain rotted in the sodden fields, the price of food skyrocketed, and what little was available was hoarded by the rich. For the vast majority of the population, the peasants who lived on the edge of subsistence, it was a death sentence. The chronicles of the time paint a horrifying picture of mass starvation. People ate their own seed grain, condemning themselves to another year of famine. They ate dogs, cats, rats, and the bark from trees. There are even widespread and credible reports of cannibalism, of desperate people digging up the newly buried to eat their corpses, or preying on the vulnerable. The social order completely broke down. This famine killed millions, perhaps as much as 10 to 15% of the population in some regions. But its most important legacy was biological. A whole generation of children who survived the famine grew into adulthood with stunted growth and severely compromised immune systems, a result of the chronic malnutrition they had endured in their formative years. Europe in 1347 was populated by a generation that was uniquely vulnerable to disease. On top of this foundation of famine, the continent was tearing itself apart with constant warfare. The 100 Years' War between England and France had begun, a conflict that would drain both kingdoms of men and resources for a century. But even outside of that major conflict, war was an endemic feature of 14th century life. Mercenary companies roamed the countryside, pillaging and looting. Lords fought lords, and cities fought cities. This constant state of conflict created waves of refugees, disrupted vital trade routes, and made the food supply even more precarious. It also forced people to crowd together for safety behind the walls of fortified towns and cities, turning these urban centers into cramped, unsanitary, and perfect incubators for disease. This was a world that was also stretched to its absolute breaking point by overpopulation. By the year 1300, the population of Europe had swelled to a level that its medieval agricultural technology could barely support. All the good farmland was in use, and people were now trying to farm marginal, unproductive lands. This created immense social and economic strain. There was a huge class of landless, impoverished peasants, a vast population living on the very precipice of disaster. Into this fragile, teetering world, a new connection was being forged. For centuries, direct contact between Europe and the Far East had been limited, but the rise of the Mongol Empire had changed everything. The conquests of Genghis Khan and his successors had created the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Europe. While the Mongol conquests were legendarily brutal, they resulted in a period of unprecedented stability and security across the vast steppes of Central Asia, a period known as the Pax Mongolica, or the Mongol Peace. For the first time in centuries, the legendary Silk Road was reopened and made safe for travel. This was a boon for merchants. Goods like silk and spices, and new ideas and technologies like gunpowder and the compass, could now flow freely from east to west. But this great transcontinental highway carried more than just cargo. It also created a perfect, unimpeded superhighway for the migration of something far more sinister: disease. Somewhere in the heart of this vast network, on the remote grasslands of Central Asia, the agent of the world's greatest pandemic was waiting in its ancient reservoir, ready to begin its journey. The birth of the pestilence. The agent of the Black Death was a microscopic killer, a rod-shaped bacterium called Yersinia pestis. This was not a new organism in the 14th century. It had existed for thousands of years and was likely responsible for the Great Plague of Justinian that had devastated the Byzantine Empire in the 6th century. Y. pestis is a zoonotic disease, meaning it primarily exists and circulates within animal populations, occasionally spilling over to infect humans. Its natural reservoir is in populations of wild rodents, such as the marmots of the Central Asian steppes. In these rodent communities, the plague can exist in a relatively stable endemic state for centuries, but occasionally, for reasons that are still not fully understood, perhaps related to climate changes, the bacteria can break out of its stable reservoir and cause a massive die-off among the rodent population. When this happens, the fleas that live on these rodents must find a new source of food. This brings us to the primary vector of the plague, the instrument of its terrifying spread, the oriental rat flea, Xenocilla chiopes. And the flea's accomplice was another animal that had learned to live alongside humans and travel with them wherever they went: the black rat, Rattus rattus. When infected fleas, having lost their original rodent hosts, found their way onto black rats, they brought the plague into the human world. Black rats thrived in the cramped, unsanitary conditions of medieval cities, and crucially, they were excellent sailors, infesting the holds of merchant ships that sailed the Silk Road's maritime routes. The biological mechanism of transmission is the stuff of nightmares. A flea bites an infected rat and ingests the plague bacteria. The bacteria then multiply rapidly in the flea's midgut, eventually forming a thick, gelatinous mass that completely blocks its digestive tract. The flea is now starving to death. In a desperate, ravenous state, it will bite any warm-blooded animal it can find, including a human. As it tries to feed, it is unable to draw any blood past the blockage in its gut. In its frantic attempts to clear the blockage, it ends up regurgitating a slurry of blood and tens of thousands of highly infectious Yersinia pestis bacteria directly into the bite wound. The human victim is now infected. Once in a human host, the plague manifested in 3 distinct and horrifying forms. The most common form, and the one that gave the pandemic its most famous symptom, was bubonic plague. After an incubation period of a few days, the victim would be struck by high fever, chills, violent vomiting, and extreme pain. Then the telltale sign would appear: the buboes. The bacteria would travel through the lymphatic system and collect in the first lymph node they reached, typically in the groin, armpits, or neck. This lymph node would swell to the size of an egg or even an apple, becoming excruciatingly painful. The bubo would turn a dark purple or black color as the tissue within became necrotic, which is one of the likely origins of the name Black Death. If the bubo burst, it released a foul-smelling pus, and the patient had a small chance of survival. If it didn't, the bacteria would overwhelm the body. This form of the plague had a mortality rate of between 30 and 70%, but it was not directly transmissible from person to person. It required the bite of an infected flea. The second form was pneumonic plague. This occurred if the Y. pestis bacteria managed to reach the lungs. The victim would develop all the symptoms of a severe pneumonia, including a high fever and a racking cough that produced a bloody, frothy sputum. This form was the true horror of the pandemic because it was airborne. It could be transmitted directly from one person to another through respiratory droplets from coughing. It was far more lethal than the bubonic form, with a mortality rate of nearly 100%, and it could kill a healthy adult in as little as 24 to 48 hours. The third and most deadly form was septicemic plague. In these cases, the bacteria multiplied so rapidly and aggressively in the bloodstream that the victim would often die before the characteristic buboes or pneumonia had time to develop. The bacteria caused a condition known as disseminated intravascular coagulation, where tiny blood clots form throughout the body, leading to ischemic necrosis, the death of tissue due to lack of blood supply. The victim's skin would turn a dark purplish-black color due to bleeding beneath the surface. This form was universally and very rapidly fatal. This triple-threat pathogen, having likely erupted from its reservoir in the 1330s, began to spread. It traveled east into China, where it caused immense devastation, and it traveled west along the Silk Road. By the 1340s, it had reached the trading caravans and the armies of the Mongol Empire. In 1346, the plague arrived at the gates of Europe. The city was Kaffa, modern-day Feodosia, a thriving and wealthy trading port on the Crimean Peninsula, operated by merchants from Genoa. The city was under siege by the army of the Golden Horde, a successor state to the Mongol Empire, led by the Khan Janibeg. As the long siege dragged on, the plague broke out among the Mongol troops, a devastating epidemic that ripped through their camp and crippled their army. The siege was lost. But before he retreated, Janibeg, in an act of legendary malice, decided to give his enemies a parting gift. He ordered his men to load the plague-ridden corpses of their own dead soldiers onto their catapults. The rotting, infectious bodies were then hurled over the city walls, landing amongst the horrified Genoese defenders. This is one of the earliest and most infamous examples of biological warfare in history. The Genoese, now trapped in a city with a festering pestilence, saw only one option. They had to escape. The Genoese merchants in Kaffa frantically made their way to their ships in the harbor. They abandoned the besieged city, hoping to outrun the disease that had been so gruesomely delivered to them. But they didn't know that it was already too late. Their ships were infested with the same black rats that had spread the plague through the Mongol camp. The fleas that lived on those rats were carrying the bacterial time bomb. And some of the sailors themselves were likely already incubating the disease, the first signs of fever and pain beginning to stir as they set sail across the Black Sea. These 12 Genoese galleys were not just refugee ships. They were floating coffins, biological weapons that were about to deliver a blow to Europe, far more devastating than any Mongol army could have ever conceived. In October of 1347, the death ships, as they would come to be known, arrived in the bustling port of Messina, Sicily. The Sicilians who gathered at the docks to greet them were met with a horrifying sight. The ships were largely adrift, most of their crew either dead or dying. The few sailors still alive were gravely ill, covered in the dark, oozing buboes, delirious with fever. The Sicilian authorities immediately ordered the ships to leave their harbor, but the damage was done. The rats scurried down the mooring ropes and into the port city. The fleas found new hosts. Within days, the plague erupted in Messina with terrifying force, and the Black Death had its first foothold in Europe. From Sicily, the plague's spread was relentless and terrifyingly fast, following the major maritime trade routes. Fleeing refugees from Messina helped spread it to the rest of Sicily and southern Italy. The same Genoese ships, or others from the region, carried it to their home port of Genoa and to the rival trading hub of Venice in the north of Italy by early 1348. From the French port of Marseille, it began its devastating march inland. The year 1348 was the year of horror, the year Europe was consumed. In Italy, the great cultured city-states were brought to their knees. In Florence, one of the wealthiest and most advanced cities in Europe, the plague killed an estimated 60% of the population. The Florentine writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the horror, chronicled it in the introduction to his famous work, The Decameron. He described a society in complete collapse. The laws, both human and divine, were ignored. People abandoned their sick family members. Parents refused to tend to their own children. He wrote of the dead being piled up in the streets, collected by cartloads at night, and thrown into massive communal plague pits. There were no tears or candles or mourners, he wrote. Things had come to such a pass that people cared no more for dead men than we care for dead goats. From Italy and France, the pestilence spread in every direction. It moved up the Rhine River into the Holy Roman Empire. It crossed the English Channel, likely arriving on a ship in the summer of 1348 at a port in Dorset. From there, it spread to Bristol and then to London. The cramped, filthy conditions of medieval London made it a tinderbox. The plague raged through the city, killing tens of thousands. By 1349, it had reached Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. By 1351, it had swept through Scandinavia and had even reached the remote shores of Greenland. In the space of about 4 years, not a single corner of Europe had been left untouched. Faced with a disease of such speed and lethality, medieval society was utterly powerless. Their understanding of medicine was based on theories that were, at best, useless and at worst, actively harmful. The prevailing scientific theory of disease was the miasma theory. Doctors believed that the plague was caused by a miasma, a poisonous or corrupt air, that was released from the earth during earthquakes or generated by the unfortunate astrological alignment of the planets. This led to treatments that focused on purifying the air. People burned aromatic woods like juniper and ash in their homes. They carried bouquets of flowers, called posies, to press against their noses when they went outside. The origin of the pocket full of posies, line in the nursery rhyme Ring Around the Rosy. Medical practice itself was based on the ancient Greek theory of the four humours, which held that the body was composed of 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was thought to be caused by an imbalance of these humours. Treatments, therefore, were aimed at rebalancing them. The most common treatment for any ailment was bloodletting, opening a vein to let the excess blood out. For a plague victim already suffering from internal bleeding and dehydration, this was often a fatal prescription. With science and medicine offering no answers and no hope, the vast majority of the population turned to the only other explanation they had: God. Many, perhaps most people, believed that the Black Death was a form of divine punishment, God's wrath poured out upon a sinful world. This led to desperate acts of public piety. Mass prayer processions were held, where the entire population of a town would march together, praying for mercy. These events, tragically, only served to bring healthy and sick people into close contact, creating perfect opportunities for the pneumonic form of the plague to spread like wildfire through the crowd. This religious fervor gave rise to one of the most bizarre and disturbing movements of the era, the flagellants. These were groups of religious fanatics who traveled from town to town, whipping themselves with leather scourges tipped with iron spikes in public displays of extreme penance. They believed that by taking on this physical suffering, they could atone for the sins of the world and convince God to lift the plague. While initially welcomed by terrified populaces, their movement became increasingly radical and was eventually condemned as heretical by the Pope. When prayer and penance failed to stop the plague, fear and paranoia took over, and people began to look for human scapegoats. The most vulnerable minority group in Europe, the Jewish communities, became the primary target of this hysteria. Utterly false rumors began to spread that the plague was an artificial conspiracy, that Jewish people were deliberately causing it by poisoning the wells of Christian towns. This led to a horrific wave of anti-Semitic violence and brutal massacres. Entire Jewish communities in cities like Strasbourg, Mainz, and Cologne were rounded up and burned alive by frenzied mobs. This, despite the fact that Jewish people were dying from the plague at the same rate as Christians, and that Pope Clement VI himself issued 2 papal bulls declaring their innocence and condemning the violence. But in a world gripped by terror and searching for answers, reason was no match for fear. Between the years 1347 and 1351, the first and most virulent wave of the Black Death swept across the globe. The demographic toll was almost incomprehensible. While precise figures are impossible to obtain, modern historians estimate that in Europe alone, the pandemic killed between 30 and 60% of the entire population. In raw numbers, this could be anywhere from 25 to 50 million people out of a total population of around 80 million. Certain areas in Spain and Italy may have lost up to 80% of their people. When you expand the scope to include the earlier outbreaks in Asia and the plagues spread through the Middle East and North Africa, the total global death toll could have been as high as 200 million people. It was, without question, the single greatest mortality event in recorded human history. But the Black Death was more than just a demographic catastrophe. It was a societal reset button. The world that emerged from the shadow of the plague was fundamentally and permanently changed. The most immediate and profound consequence was a massive labor shortage. With up to half of the workforce dead, The carefully balanced economic structure of the medieval world was shattered. For the first time in centuries, the power dynamic between the land-owning nobility and the peasants who worked the land was completely upended. Suddenly, laborers were a scarce and valuable commodity. Peasants and skilled artisans found that they could demand higher wages, better working conditions, and more freedom. This led to the collapse of the old system of feudalism. For centuries, most peasants had been serfs, legally tied to the land they worked and obligated to their lord. Now, desperate landlords were forced to compete for workers. They began to offer wages, to lease land to tenants for cash, and to commute the traditional labor services in exchange for rent. This gave the surviving peasants a level of economic freedom and social mobility that their ancestors could have never dreamed of. While the nobility tried to fight back, passing laws to cap wages, it was too late. The old feudal order was broken beyond repair. The Black Death didn't single-handedly end feudalism, but it massively accelerated its decline. This labor shortage also spurred a wave of technological innovation. With human labor now expensive and scarce, landowners and business owners had a powerful incentive to invest in labor-saving technologies. This led to advancements in agriculture, such as new types of plows and more efficient crop rotation systems. It drove innovation in mining, textiles, and other industries. The post-plague world was one that was forced to become more efficient and more inventive. The cultural and psychological impact of the plague was just as profound. The omnipresence of sudden, arbitrary death left a deep scar on the European psyche. This was reflected in the art and literature of the period. A new artistic motif, the danse macabre, or dance of death, became incredibly popular. These artworks depicted animated skeletons leading people from all walks of life, popes, kings, knights, merchants, and peasants, in a grim dance to their graves. The message was clear and uncompromising. Death was the great equalizer, and no one, no matter how powerful, could escape its grasp. People's attitudes towards the church also shifted. The institution had been utterly powerless to stop the pestilence. Its prayers had gone unanswered, its holy relics had offered no protection, and its priests had died just as frequently as the common folk. While the plague certainly led to a surge in personal piety for some, for many others, it planted a seed of doubt and cynicism. The church's authority, which had been absolute in the medieval world, was weakened. This new willingness to question religious authority is seen by many historians as one of the long-term cultural shifts that helped pave the way for the intellectual ferment of the Renaissance and the religious upheaval of the Protestant Reformation a century and a half later. The Black Death was not the end of the world, but it was the end of a world. It was a crucible of unimaginable horror that burned away the foundations of the medieval age. Its rigid social structures, its economic systems, and its cultural certainties.